let's learn about the exports property in TypeScript. So the exports property in TypeScript defines the interface to your library. So it defines what can be imported from your library. So when you write something like comments work, import X from Y, you can say what can be, what is exported from Y. You can define this with the exports property. But like all things in life, it is a bit complicated. So when you start a new library and you simply write npm init, it will create a package.json file that looks much like this here. And one thing you notice, there isn't even an exports property. Instead, there is this main property here. And this is a bit of a relic from the past. So JavaScript is in many regards a bit of a mess, and the part that is the most messy is the module system and the way how modules are resolved. It is even messy to this day, I would argue, because there's all this ambiguity about, do you need file extensions, don't you need file extensions? I don't know, it's still a bit complicated. But back in the day, JavaScript didn't really have a native way to define imports and outputs, how to resolve code defined in different files. And Node, which was kind of the first major JavaScript runtime, came up with this way of defining imports and exports, and it was called common.js. It used this function called require that took a string as an argument, and then you could kind of import modules as a bit of magic baked into that. You could import modules this way. And in the nice Node world that we had, there was only, because the language itself didn't have a way to define imports and exports, there was just one way, which was common.js, to define what gets imported and exported from modules. And this is where the main property came from. The main property just defined the entry point into our library, and it does to this day. But things have gotten a bit more complicated. JavaScript added native support for imports and exports, and it did so differently than common.js, so differently than Node did. It defined ECMAScript modules, so ESM commonly known. And for a while, we lived in this world with two conflicting standards, common.js and ESM. But all we had to define the entry point into our libraries was this main property here. So we had to get creative if we wanted to write libraries that would work both in the browser and on the server. And people came up with things like UMD format, something that would check at runtime if you're using common.js or ESM, and then would adapt the way code was imported on the fly at runtime. But this obviously wasn't ideal. And to get around this, while we had the two conflicting standards, we still have them to this day, the exports property was added. And the exports property is much more flexible. It allows you to react to the consumer of your library. So you can write something like exports, and this does the exact same thing that the main property does. When you say dot here, and then you define, let's say, dist index.js, it basically says the exact same thing as the main property. It says, no matter what consumer of my library you are, use this one entry point, which is defined in dist.index.js. The difference here is that the exports property is much more flexible than the main property, which you can already see because it's an object instead of just a simple string. A thing you can do many things with the exports property, but a thing you can say import, and this means that consumers using ESM will be pointed to one entry point of your library. This means you can use a bundler, for example, to create a specific bundled version of your library that is transpiled into ESM, but then you can also say require and point this to a different entry point, let's say dist index.cjs. And this would be the exact same version of your library, but bundled into common.js. And there are a lot of tools that can do this automatically, like TSC, but also bundlers like Webpack or Rollup. You can configure them in a way that with every build, they produce their output in ESM and CommonJS. And if you want to do this and then point consumers of your library to the correct version of your library, you can use the imports property. Another neat thing is that with the exports property, you can define multiple entry points into your library. For example, if you want people to import things from the root of your library, so this means like import X from, here we call the library best library ever. This would work, but then you could also define something like utils, for example, and you can go and point this to the utils folder, and then consumers using import X from best library ever / utils, this would also work. Another important thing to note about the exports property is that the exports property makes the API, so the interface, the things that can be imported from, explicit. This means users can only import X from the things you defined here. So they can only import from the root of your library and they can import from utils. This is allowed. But if they import from XXXXX, this will fail. You may think that the main property does it in the same way, but it actually doesn't. Usually it's best practice to just define your interface in the index.js file to just export everything you want to export in that file. But with the main property, we can actually use deep imports without even specifying them. So here you can see in the dist file, we have a file called a.js. So when someone types in import X from best library ever /a, as long as this module works, the import will correctly resolve. And that file is importable without explicitly being marked as such. Another thing to note is that there are some other tools like TypeScript, for example, that make use of the exports property, and you can define something like, then you have to write a default here, and this means like by default, or the default import for consumers is this JavaScript file, but then you can also define special type entry points. So you have multiple entry points into your library, but then you bundle your types for these entry points in a different way per entry point. It doesn't even have to be, you can point to, usually the DTS files mirror the structures of your library, and then you can just point to the matching type entry point. I don't know. It's a bit up to your choice how you wanna if you wanna roll up your types, or it's a different topic. Yeah, but to wrap things up, the exports property is a new way, and probably the way you should use to define the API and interface of your library. It gets around the limitations of the main field by letting the consumer of your library decide which version of your library they want to import, and it lets you as the library creator explicitly define what consumers you support for your library. Lastly, there are some third-party tools like TypeScript that build on the exports property and extend it with custom properties like the types field here to allow you to have multiple types entry points. Yeah, and that's all you probably need to know about the exports property. If you want to learn more, read in the official TypeScript docs. I'll link them below this video. And thanks for watching. See you soon.